I wouldn't like to start this story with a somewhat sad fact. But I have no choice. Of the many things I've lived through over many and not so many years, I'll start with this one. The experiences I'm going to tell you about happened in a small town in warm Sinaloa, Mexico, many years ago, when organized crime weighed a little heavier. One day a truck with armed men, obviously dedicated to that kind of business, arrived and confronted a man who was under a pingüica tree while he was saddling a horse. When the truck stopped, and for reasons we never knew, they set fire to that man. It wasn't a small or light attack. The man died right there under that tree. We never knew the cause, and to be honest, we didn't want to investigate it much either, so we were left with the doubt. It was probably better that way. Months passed, and my uncle had a job that consisted of sleeping at a family's house. The property had belonged to well-off people, so the house was very big, completely surrounded by a fence with a large courtyard. It was divided into two houses within the same area. One had the kitchen, living room and the master's bedroom. That's where my uncle slept, and the other had the children's rooms and another living room. My uncle was the only one who had to spend the night there, a job almost like a sailor's watch. His shift started well past midnight. At night I always watched the news at his house a while before walking to the other house, his boss's, where I would spend the night taking care of her. He would leave at 11 and the property was a bit isolated. My uncle would prepare his things and walk through those lonely streets of town. He crossed alleys and partially mountainous streets, passing many houses and even some small temples. The darkness of some areas and the scarce street lighting made it feel lonelier. As he passed in front of Don Pedro's house, my uncle saw, from the street, Don Pedro under that pingüica tree inside his property, trying a horse. "Why are you saddling so late, Don Pedro? It's already midnight. Better go to sleep," my uncle shouted from the small fence outside. "No, Hio, I'm taking advantage of the fact that it's not that hot. I'm almost done," Don Pedro replied from under the tree. My uncle's name was Raymundo, and people in town called him Mundo, world. He simply laughed, said goodbye, and kept walking. But as he turned a T-shaped corner, almost at his destination, he remembered that Don Pedro had died many months earlier. A chill ran through his whole body, from the tips of his feet to his head, the kind of chill you never forget. He said he'd never felt anything like it again. Of course, thinking that, he hurried his steps to get home as quickly as possible. Turning back to see if Don Pedro was still sitting there wasn't an option. He got home, locked up as usual, and spent the night there, a little scared, but not enough to ruin his rest. Then, in the silence of dawn, someone knocked on the heavy sheet gate that was the only entrance to the property. The gate made a lot of noise when someone called, so it was almost impossible not to hear. My uncle went to the gate. Who could it be at this time? He wondered, as he took the key and opened. There was no one outside. He thought maybe they had been mistaken, or maybe they had thought nobody was home because he had taken too long to get to the gate. Any similar explanation, but the knocking happened for 7 mornings in a row, without fail, always in the early dawn. And when he went to check, there was never anyone at the gate. This began to tire my uncle. He told me the situation was wearing him down. He admitted he hadn't even dared look at Don Pedro's house when he passed it. Sometimes he left earlier so there would at least be people on the street. On one occasion, when he passed Don Pedro's house, he said he heard someone talking to him, but he didn't turn around. He wouldn't tell me much more, but I knew he was afraid. I told him the next night I would go with him. I'd wait near the entrance, ready to open quickly if the knocking happened again. We couldn't rule out that someone was playing a joke. He agreed. The next night my uncle took a chair and his little radio that kept him company when he wasn't watching television. He sat next to the large sheet gate and didn't even leave the key on the lock so he could open as quickly as possible. It didn't take long before the knocking sounded, just like the previous nights. He stood up instantly, opened the gate, and there was absolutely no one outside, not a soul, not a sound of someone running away. There wasn't much place to hide there, either. Everything looked like whatever we'd been imagining. My uncle thought Don Pedro had been the one knocking night after night. So he decided to take a fan during the day and put it under that tree where Don Pedro had lost his life. The next day he took it, left it there, and when he came back to work that night and from that night on, they never knocked on that door again.